The 19th of July, 2016, we're approaching midnight once again on the second day of the Republican National Convention. This was a day filled with shocking precedent, totalitarianism, Gestapo tactics, blatant, impudent anti-democratic behavior, and so forth have abounded. Now, we have to remember that the roll call of the states is the highest decision-making body, the source of all power and all legitimacy in a modern U.S. political party. So today, we had the roll call of the states from Alabama to Wyoming, and they have voted Donald J. Trump as the Republican presidential nominee. And there will be a pro forma proceeding perhaps tomorrow, similar proceeding about having Michael Pence become the vice presidential nominee. However, let's focus on this roll call of the states. There is no higher authority than what we're seeing right here. And it has been perverted in a monstrous form beyond anything that I can remember in quite a while, and I'll talk about my sample. If you have two roll calls of the states, you have two political parties, and that's what we had today. Yesterday, you'll recall, we had the beginning of the splintering of the Republican Party when the gang around Manafort and Priebus refused to allow a simple roll call vote, the same kind of exercise, on the question of whether the report of the Rules Committee should be accepted or not. Today, this has gone much further. Essentially, during today's roll call of the states, we had one vote count that was being made by the people on the podium, the hacks, the time servers, the wheel horses of the Republican apparatus. And all of these people are agents of Reince Priebus, who is becoming increasingly a totalitarian party boss in the Nazi or Soviet traditions. Stalin or Bormann or Hess would recognize Reince Priebus rather readily. So as the vote count went along, you began to hear a kind of a dissonance, that there was one count of the votes up on the podium, and there was a completely different vote count that was happening on the floor among the delegations, the vote totals that were read off by the various state chairs or state leaders. It was the most plastic, the most stark portrayal of a party which is splitting into two parts. They can't even agree on the vote count in their own national convention. Now, of course, the reason for this is that there was a totalitarian, Gestapo-enforced vote count, which was being rammed down the throats of everybody by Reince Priebus. And remember, we said yesterday that one of the reasons for so much turbulence on the floor and this question of trying to get a roll call vote is that there are people there with grievances that antedate Trump, that didn't start with Trump, that have been there for quite a while before Trump. And those people are trying to make the party less dictatorial, less of a lockstep, less coercive in regard to the delegates. Right? Some of these people are libertarians, but a lot of them are just classic sort of Buckleyite reactionaries. So they were afraid that there would be some anti-Trump votes. Well, there were going to be, and there have been, several hundred, 500 or 600 anti-Trump votes. That's about the estimate I gave you yesterday, I think, of the anti-Trump forces. So there were going to be some anti-Trump votes. It was not going to be the classic Soviet election with a 99.9% vote for the ruling party. Trump is not in a position to do that, although he'd like to. But the idea was that Trump feared to be delegitimized and embarrassed and humiliated by a large number, maybe 1,000 or 1,500, well, not quite 1,500, but 1,100 or something close to to half of the delegates. Trump was very, very much afraid of this. So they decided to institute this system where the chairwoman would read aloud to the delegations how they were supposed to vote, and they answered with whatever they were going to say. It was quite often congruent. Quite often they said the same things, but not always. But the big thing, before we get into the details to document this, you have today seen a party split into two parts. And as one of the founders of this particular political formation said, the House divided against itself cannot stand, quoting, of course, the Bible. The other thing about this, which I find extremely sinister, the yellow caps. In the course of history, we've seen Mussolini and his black shirts. We have seen Hitler and his brown shirts. We have heard of, some people have heard of the indigenous American ones, right? Pelé and his silver shirts, all fascists, right? All practically Nazis. Today we have the yellow caps, and they're not going to help you carry your bag. What they're going to do is dictate to you what you think and how you're going to talk and how you're going to vote. And you can see them once you get the idea of the yellow caps, you can see them all over the floor, and they're like blood cells, right? White blood cells. They congregate around activities thought to be heretical. So let's look at this. Let's take the case of the District of Columbia. I'm not going to bore you. I'll just take two. The District of Columbia, the chairman of that delegation from the floor read a result which said, the District of Columbia casts 9 votes for Kasich, 10 votes for Trump. I'm sorry, 9 votes for Kasich, 10 votes for Cruz, and 0 votes for Trump. 9 Kasich, 10 Cruz, 0 Trump. And then from the podium, we heard coming back, according to our rules, the District of Columbia casts all 19 votes for Donald J. Trump. It's unbelievable. It's outrageous. It's Orwellian. It's anti-American. It's a high-handed outrage. How long can this go on? It's horrendous. Let's take the case of Alaska. In the case of Alaska, it was a little bit more complex. The vote total as read from the floor by the people who had decided it at their state convention. And remember, this is supposed to be the party of states' rights. Well, you can forget that with Reince Priebus and his gang of hatchet men. The Alaska delegation said, according to the deliberations of our state party convention, which we did very specially, deliberately for this event, Cruz 12, Rubio 5, Trump 11. So the charming lady up on the podium says, all your votes just went to Trump. Now, the interesting thing is that the state of Alaska, thank God for rugged individualists, they protested at the end of the roll call of the states when Wyoming had finished and all the votes had been cast. And it was clear that Trump was going to be the nominee. He was practically the nominee. Only a little formality of a declaration separated him from being the nominee. Alaska up and said, you did not record our votes correctly. We protest. We want to be polled. And polled means you got to go back to the delegation and ask each one of them. It's like polling the jury. You got to ask them, who are you voting for here? Yes, said the guy from Alaska, right? We want to stop the process. And indeed, they stopped the clock for 10 or 15 minutes while the delegation was polled. And then, of course, out came Priebus and his gang, and they read their opinion, and you could hear the sound of the steamroller coming towards you. They said, yes, well, we decide here what the rules are for counting delegates, so all of your votes go to Trump. Now, I have to point out how stupid this is, how self-defeating. But first of all, how surreal. One of Trump's sons found his father's nomination surreal. Some of us find this macabre, a grand guignol. Once again, the machinations are unbelievable. The Gestapo tactics against anybody who protests. Some of these people, I'm sure, have been, their lives have been threatened. Their children's lives have been threatened. Their houses have been threatened. We're basically at the level of cross burnings for some of these delegates. But it is one of the most profound offenses against American tradition I've ever seen. I have been watching Republican conventions since 1952. As a tiny child at the age of 6, I was sitting on the carpet of my grandmother's house, and we watched the 1952 Republican convention. And you remember the centerpiece, as I remember clearly, was a roll call vote between the Taft forces and the Eisenhower forces about who would win on a certain rule question. And it was a kind of a test of strength, and it turned out the Eisenhower forces were stronger. I was for Eisenhower. My grandmother was for Robert Taft. I was gagged, as I recounted yesterday, at the corner of Michigan Balboa in August of 1968. The whole world was watching, and we said, "Dump the hump." So that was actually a convention where quite a few people did leave because they feared for their lives. In 1992, I tried to get the question of the death penalty put on the schedule of the convention. And for this, I went with others to Foley Square Federal Court twice. And we were told to get out of there because it was a private association. The Democratic Party didn't have to follow its own rules. So I've seen some pretty wild stuff, but I've never, ever seen anything as monstrous, as arrogant, as Orwellian, as double thinking as what we've seen today. The Republican Party has split into two parts, and don't lose sight of this fact. Now, the other big question is why do this, right? Trump had the votes. He was going to take the nomination. It was the difference between having 200 or 300 or so 400 votes against him and having maybe 900 or 1,000 or something like that. Nobody knows because a lot of it was suppressed by sort of preemptive arm twisting. But it is a useless and suicidal exercise. And even commentators on television try to say, why not let them express themselves in some way? These poor, doomed, defeated little delegates that you're insisting on crushing them, right? Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel, right? You don't have to use the heavy stuff on very weak and frail creatures. So it is also compulsive and psychotic because it reflects a kind of a fear, an overwhelming fear of what might be coming if somebody repudiates you and rejects you and disses you, right? This is Trump of the narcissistic personality syndrome and also, of course, of the compulsive, obsessive compulsive disorder and manic depressive and other syndromes. So Trump appeared briefly tonight to remind us that he got more votes than anybody in the primaries of the Republican Party. What he never says is he drew people to vote for him, but he drew even more people to vote against him. 53% of the Republican primary voters voted against Trump. He only came out of there with 47%. Now, say a couple of things about what happened overnight. Or actually, first, we ought to talk about Ohio. Ohio is, of course, the center of the universe for every sane, rational Republican candidate. We know that Ohio has this special quality. No Republican presidential candidate has ever won the presidency without taking Ohio. So a rational person becoming the nominee of the Republican Party would say, my number one job is to ingratiate myself with every precinct captain, with every party official, with every county chairman, with governor and his advisors. I should be sending them to the Bahamas. I should be lionizing them. I should be currying favor with them every way I can. But not the obsessive, compulsive, psychotic, sick sociopath, sleazy, psychotic Donald Trump. Yesterday, his thuggish campaign manager, and that would be Manafort, clashed at a distance, at least with Kasich. He began insulting him. At a press conference at breakfast on Monday, Manafort started attacking Kasich because he's petulant. He's embarrassing his party in Ohio. Negotiations broke down, and Manafort says that Kasich is dumb, dumb, dumb. Well, maybe he's not so dumb. Maybe he wants to not lash himself to the corpse or the carcass of the doomed political movement around Trump. And here's the idea: the political advisor to Governor Kasich hit back. The Manafort and so forth said that they couldn't agree with Kasich because Kasich's advisors think that he'll have a better chance of becoming president in 2016 by not supporting Donald Trump. I think that's good advice Kasich is getting. So the answer to that from Weaver, one of these advisors to Kasich, the Kasich camp says, Manafort's problem after all those years on the lam with thugs and autocrats is that he can't recognize principle and integrity. I do congratulate him, though, congratulate Manafort, on a great pivot at the start of the convention after such a successful vice presidential launch. And of course, that's dripping with irony because the vice presidential launch of Pence is a laughingstock. There are 5 or 6 occasions, right? Veep launch, acceptance speech, 3 debates. That's about it. And Trump has already blown the Veep launch. And let's see what he does with the acceptance speech. So I congratulate, again, the Kasich camp says, I congratulate Manafort and Trump on the great pivot that they've done at the start of the convention after this wonderful vice presidential launch. They have brought great professionalism direct from Kiev to Trump world. Now, that's Yanukovych. Some deluded, ignorant, drooling individuals seem to think that Yanukovych is a great guy. When I was in Donetsk People's Republic, Yanukovych is a dirty word because he's the guy who would not fight. He had an army. He had Berkut. He had secret police. He had all that. They hate him in Donetsk because he wouldn't give the order to resist. So people who are yapping about this, right, the yelping critics should go back and get back under their rock. Now, overnight we had the other question, and this also could be psychologically quite important. The Ohio thing could be the election right there. In other words, the best political machine in Ohio is the one that answers to Kasich. You want to win Ohio, that's the machine you need. And it's getting pretty clear Trump will not have it. And maybe that will doom him in Ohio. So we see another example of evil fighting evil and somehow managing to generate some good. Now, the other side. Melania Trump gave a speech yesterday evening, which was well received. I won't comment on this in terms of the content because I think it's all pabulum. It's all cliches. But it was then found after an hour or so that she had plagiarized, or somebody had plagiarized, the contents of part of the speech, a couple of paragraphs, a good 120 words or so. And it was found that these paragraphs had been lifted practically verbatim from a 2008 speech by Michelle Obama in the course of presenting herself to the Democratic National Convention. We can call this Copygate. So Copygate is reported to have driven Trump into apoplectic rage. As a matter of fact, last night he flew home from Cleveland to New York City and has not been seen since in public. He did deliver some comments this evening. And again, this was some bluster and some cliches and some other stuff. My personal guess is Trump is on his way to a nervous breakdown. And something like Copygate and the humiliation of Melania may push him over the line, especially in this sense. The great leader, right? The great Führer, the Duce of the Republican Party now, Donald Trump, has a dilemma because it's reported reliably that the reason that this plagiarized material was inserted in poor Melania's speech was that it was done by a close aide and associate of Manafort. Okay? So Manafort is really on the hook for the debacle of this speech, right? Now, Melania may be close to a nervous breakdown. I think, again, Trump probably is. So, in a certain way, Trump has a choice now. Are you going to fire Manafort or are you going to lose your marriage? And is that either one of those or both could be taking place on camera between now and November 8th? And so far, Trump has been ducking the decision. He's been the coward that you suspect. Scratch a bully, find a coward. Trump is a bully. Scratch him up a little bit. You'll find that coward cowering in there. So Trump has been ducking the decision. Manafort doesn't duck anything. Manafort goes on television and says to the television reporters, Melania knew exactly what she was doing. What does that mean? Manafort is throwing Melania under the bus. So Donald Trump, if you value your marriage, you better do something about this. And this is based on reports from people quite close to them. So that's the copygate. We'll have to see whether Trump can contain himself during the next 2 days and whether he'll start raving or chewing the carpet or foaming at the mouth during his acceptance speech. A couple of other important things from today. In 1987, there was a book published called The Art of the Deal, and on the cover it said Donald Trump and Tony Schwartz. Tony Schwartz wrote the entire book. He got half of the advance and half of the royalties. $500,000, half of the advance of $1 million. So Tony Schwartz has now discovered his conscience, and he is seized by remorse. He's the ghostwriter. He's known in his circles now as Dr. Frankenstein because he created this monster which can now turn and destroy us all. Schwartz says he's the guy who put lipstick on the pig of Donald Trump. And quite explicitly, Schwartz has the brains, I think, to see that if Trump ever got his hands on the nuclear codes, he fears that we would see World War III and the destruction of civilization as we've known it. And I think that is absolutely realistic. I applaud Tony Schwartz for coming forward now, better late than never. And the other important thing, in addition to the nuclear war, how you might get there, Trump presents himself as a normal thinking adult. He's not. According to Tony Schwartz, who spent hundreds of hours with him over a period of 18 months, Trump has an attention span of about 2 minutes. So can we imagine Trump in the briefing room and he's getting reports, Mr. President, the Russians are doing this, China's doing this, the economic situation, the markets are crashing, and all of that. And Trump is expected to absorb that and integrate it and make some sense out of it. That is absolutely absurd. So he has no attention span. And people, we had his sons on the television tonight saying that if you're in trouble, you can call Donald Trump. Donald Trump has no time for you. And if your story is more than 3 or 4 sentences at the level of second grade vocabulary, poor Trump can't even understand you. He is, in that sense, a moron, an imbecile, in addition to being a fascist and a psychotic and a corrupt gangster type who essentially feeds at the public trough. So that's the wrap up here on the second day. Once again, it's Tuesday, the 19th of July. We've had a first day where the Republican Party blatantly violated its own rules. The splintering and fracturing was quite obvious. And today we had a literal visual depiction of a split party with two vote counts going on. There were two vote counts in the same room. There were two votes going on in the same room involving some of the same people, but not all. And those vote counts turned out to be different. How different? I'll try to get the exact figures tomorrow. But take a look at some of that stuff on C-SPAN, and you'll see Alaska and District of Columbia. You're going to see that what the podium says and what the actual delegation says are two different things. So democracy trampled. Trump is the insiders. Trump is the elite. Trump is not a rebel in any sense. Trump is simply a more sophisticated deployment of Wall Street. So I say to whoever you are out there, petty bourgeois, blue collar, whatever you are, libertarians, run for your lives before he gets his hands on the nuclear code. From Washington, this has been Webster Tarpley.